Venezuela just rewrote the rules and no one noticed. Let me take you back to January 10, 2024. That was the day Nicolas Maduro, in a move that barely registered on the radar of most Western media, announced the annexation of a vast swath of Guyana's Essequibo region, a territory larger than England, rich in oil, gold, and geopolitical leverage. The official story? A long-standing border dispute, a referendum, a sovereign claim. The reality? Something far more consequential. This wasn't just another Latin American land grab. This was Venezuela testing the limits of a new world order, one where the old rules of American hegemony no longer apply. And if we don't pay attention, we're going to wake up one day to find the global chessboard has been rearranged without us. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow unraveling of U.S. dominance. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another analysis, it's a warning. Because what happened in Essequibo isn't an isolated incident. It's the opening move in a much larger game, one where the rules are being rewritten in real time, and the West is still playing by the old ones. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story you've probably heard, if you've heard anything at all. Venezuela has long claimed the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory that makes up nearly 2/3 of Guyana. The dispute dates back to the 19th century, when British colonial maps drew the border in a way that Caracas has always contested. Fast forward to 2015, when ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyanese waters, reserves that, by some estimates, could make Guyana the world's 4th largest oil producer by the end of the decade. Venezuela, mired in economic collapse, suddenly had a reason to revive its claim. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum where 95% of voters supposedly backed annexing Essequibo. A few weeks later, he announced the creation of a new Venezuelan state called Guayana Essequiba, complete with military bases, oil concessions, and a direct challenge to Guyana's sovereignty. The U.S. response? Predictable. The State Department issued a statement reaffirming support for Guyana's territorial integrity. The Pentagon sent a few warships to conduct routine exercises in the region. The OAS and the UN weighed in, urging dialogue. And that, for most of the world, was the end of the story. A minor flare-up in a distant corner of the globe, easily contained by the usual diplomatic posturing. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that Venezuela is acting alone. It assumes that this is just another case of a failing state lashing out. And most dangerously, it assumes that the old rules of American power still apply, that a sternly worded statement and a naval deployment are enough to deter a country that has spent the last decade systematically dismantling U.S. influence in its own backyard. The data doesn't support this. The timing doesn't support this. And the geopolitical alignments behind this move? They don't support this at all. What's really happening in Essequibo? Let's start with the referendum. 95% support sounds impressive, but in a country where the opposition is jailed, the media is state-controlled, and dissent is met with violence, the number is meaningless. What's more telling is that the referendum wasn't just about Essequibo, it was about rewriting Venezuela's constitution to create a new defense doctrine that explicitly rejects U.S. interference. That's not a border dispute. That's a declaration of strategic realignment. Now, consider the timing. Why now? Venezuela's economy is in tatters, yes, but it's also sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. For years, Maduro has been locked in a high-stakes game with the U.S., trading sanctions relief for oil concessions. The Biden administration, desperate for energy supplies amid the Ukraine war, has been quietly easing restrictions on Venezuelan oil exports. But here's the Maduro has no intention of playing by Washington's rules. He's not looking for a lifeline. He's looking for leverage. And he's getting it from somewhere else. In the months leading up to the Essequibo gambit, Venezuela signed a series of military and economic agreements with Russia and China. Moscow sent advanced S-300 air defense systems to Caracas. Beijing inked a $1.2 billion deal to develop Venezuela's gold mines that just happened to be located in Essequibo. Meanwhile, Iran, another U.S. adversary, has been helping Venezuela evade sanctions and rebuild its refineries. This isn't just about oil. It's about creating a bloc of states that can defy US pressure with impunity. Here's where it gets interesting. The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Venezuela as a rogue state, a pariah to be isolated and contained. But Maduro isn't playing by the old rules. He's not trying to overthrow the US. He's not even trying to win a war. He's doing something far more. He's demonstrating that the US can't enforce its will anymore. Think about it. If Venezuela can annex a territory the size of Florida without triggering a serious US response, what's to stop Nicaragua from seizing a chunk of Costa Rica? Or Bolivia from reviving its claim to Chile's Atacama region? Or, for that matter, what's to stop China from making a move on Taiwan if it knows the US won't risk a direct confrontation? This is the real significance of Essequibo. It's not just a border dispute. It's a test case for a new era of great power competition, one where the US is no longer the sole arbiter of global order. The exited geopolitical, the great unraveling. To understand why this matters, we need to out. The post-Cold War era was defined by a single, unchallenged the United States. For 30 years, Washington set the rules. Countries that played by them, like Germany, Japan, and South Korea, prospered. Countries that didn't, like Iraq, Libya, and Venezuela, faced sanctions, coups, or invasions. But that era is ending. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple centers of influence, and the old rules no longer apply. This isn't just academic theory. It's playing out in real time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the first major challenge to the US-led order, but it was framed as an exception, a throwback to 20th century imperialism. Essequibo is different. It's not a great power flexing its muscles. It's a smaller state, backed by great powers, testing the limits of what it can get away with. And if Venezuela succeeds, it won't be the last. Let's talk about the players involved. Russia has been the most aggressive in challenging US dominance. But Moscow's strategy isn't about direct confrontation. It's about creating a network of client states that can tie down US resources and undermine its credibility. Venezuela is a perfect example. By providing military support and economic lifelines, Russia isn't just propping up Maduro, it's creating a foothold in America's backyard. And it's doing so at minimal cost. A few $1 billion in arms sales, a few hundred military advisors, and suddenly the US is forced to divert attention and resources to a crisis it thought it had contained. China, meanwhile, is playing the long game. Beijing doesn't want to start wars. It wants to win them without firing a shot. Its strategy in Venezuela is loans, infrastructure projects, and resource extraction. But make no mistake, those investments come with strings attached. When China builds a port in Venezuela, it's not just for trade. It's for future naval access. When it funds oil projects in Essequibo, it's not just for profit. It's to secure a strategic asset that the US can't touch. And then there's Iran, the wild card. Tehran's involvement in Venezuela is less about geopolitics and more about survival. Both countries are under US sanctions, and both have learned that the best way to counter American pressure is to create alternative financial and logistical networks. Iran's oil for gold scheme with Venezuela is a direct challenge to the dollar's dominance. Its military cooperation, including the transfer of drones and missile technology, is a way to project power into the Western Hemisphere without risking a direct confrontation with the US. Now, here's the key: none of these countries are acting out of altruism. They're not trying to liberate Venezuela. They're exploiting its weakness to advance their own interests. And in doing so, they're creating a new model of great power competition, one where the US is no longer the sole enforcer of global rules. This is the real significance of Essequibo. It's not just about a piece of land. It's about the erosion of American power. And if we don't recognize that, we're going to keep being surprised by the next crisis, and the one after that. Military and strategic: the illusion of control. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the rubber meets the road. The US has responded to the Essequibo crisis with the usual diplomatic statements, naval deployments, and vague threats of consequences. But here's the: none of these tools are actually effective in the current geopolitical environment. First, the naval deployments. The US sent a few ships to conduct exercises with Guyana. That's it. No show of force, no blockade, no serious deterrent. Why? Because the US military is stretched thin. Between Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and a dozen other flashpoints, there simply aren't enough ships, planes, or troops to go around. And even if there were, the political will to use them is lacking. After 2 decades of failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public has no appetite for another foreign intervention. Second, the sanctions. The US has imposed sanctions on Venezuela for years, and they've been an abject failure. They've impoverished the Venezuelan people, enriched the regime's cronies, and driven Caracas into the arms of Russia, China, and Iran. And now, with the world's energy markets in flux, the US can't afford to cut off Venezuelan oil entirely. That's why the Biden administration has been quietly easing restrictions, because the alternative is higher gas prices and an even more desperate Maduro. Third, the diplomatic efforts. The US has pushed for negotiations, but negotiations require leverage. And right now, the US has none. Maduro knows that the US won't invade. He knows that the OAS is divided. He knows that the UN Security Council is paralyzed by Russian and Chinese vetoes. So why would he negotiate in good faith? He's playing a game of chicken, and he's betting that the US will blink first. Now, let me be, I'm not saying the US should invade Venezuela. That would be a disaster. But what I am saying is that the current approach, half-hearted sanctions, symbolic military deployments, and empty diplomatic posturing, isn't working. And if we don't recognize that, we're going to keep losing ground. The real military risk here isn't a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. It's the precedent that's being set. If Venezuela can annex Essequibo without facing serious consequences, what's to stop other countries from doing the same? What's to stop China from making a move on Taiwan if it knows the US won't risk a war? What's to stop Russia from pushing further into Eastern Europe if it believes NATO is too divided to respond? This is the danger of the current moment. The US is still operating under the assumption that its military dominance is enough to deter aggression. But in a multipolar world, military power is only one tool among many. And right now, the US is being outmaneuvered on every other front. The domestic political why Washington can't get its act together. Here's where things get really messy. The US response to the Essequibo crisis isn't just shaped by geopolitics. It's also shaped by domestic politics, and that's making the situation even worse. Let's start with the Biden administration. On paper, the White House should be handling this crisis with a steady hand. But in reality, it's paralyzed by internal divisions. The State Department wants to take a hard line on Venezuela, but the Treasury Department is pushing for sanctions relief to ease energy prices. The Pentagon wants to send a clear message to Russia and China, but the White House is worried about escalation. And Congress? It's too busy fighting over Ukraine funding and border security to focus on a crisis in South America. Then there's the 2024 election. Venezuela is a political football, and both parties are using it to score points. Republicans are accusing Biden of being soft on Maduro, while Democrats are trying to distance themselves from the failed policies of the Trump era. Neither side has a coherent strategy. Neither side is thinking long-term. And that's the real problem. The U.S. foreign policy establishment is trapped in a cycle of short-term thinking. Every crisis is treated as an isolated incident, rather than part of a larger pattern. Every response is reactive, rather than strategic. And every decision is shaped by domestic political considerations, rather than national interests. Take the sanctions on Venezuela. The Trump administration imposed them to punish Maduro for human rights abuses and election fraud. The Biden administration eased them to secure oil supplies. Neither approach worked, because neither was part of a broader strategy. Sanctions alone won't topple Maduro, and oil concessions alone won't buy his loyalty. What's needed is a comprehensive approach, one that combines economic pressure, diplomatic engagement, and a clear-eyed assessment of U.S. interests. But that's not what we're getting. Instead, we're getting a series of half measures, driven by political expediency rather than strategic vision. And that's why the US keeps losing ground. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US and its allies manage to contain the crisis through diplomacy. Guyana agrees to some form of joint resource development with Venezuela in exchange for a freeze on military actions. The US offers limited sanctions relief, and Maduro backs down, at least temporarily. Russia and China lose interest, and the status quo is preserved. This is the outcome that the State Department is hoping for. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has no incentive to back down. He's already demonstrated that he can defy the US without facing serious consequences. And as long as he has the backing of Russia and China, he's not going to give up his leverage. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the crisis simmers but doesn't boil over. Venezuela maintains its claim to Essequibo, but stops short of a full-scale invasion. The US and Guyana conduct joint military exercises, but no troops are deployed. Sanctions remain in place, but they're not enforced rigorously. Russia and China continue to provide economic and military support to Venezuela, but they don't escalate the situation. This is the muddling through scenario. It's not a solution. It's a stalemate. And it's the most likely outcome because none of the major players have an interest in a full-blown conflict. But it's also the most dangerous, because it sets a precedent. If Venezuela can get away with annexing Essequibo, other countries will try the same thing. And over time, the US will find itself increasingly powerless to stop them. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. In this scenario, the crisis escalates. Venezuela launches a limited military incursion into Essequibo, seizing key oil fields. Guyana, backed by the US, responds with airstrikes. Russia and China increase their military support to Venezuela, and the US is forced to choose between backing down or risking a direct confrontation with nuclear-armed powers. This is the nightmare scenario. It's not likely, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, it could trigger a wider conflict, one that draws in other countries and destabilizes the entire region. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case outcome is a temporary fix, not a real solution. But the point is the US is not in control of this crisis. And the longer it pretends that it is, the worse things are going to get. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. This brings me to the bigger picture. The Essequibo crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could maintain global dominance through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and liberal institutionalism. The idea was if the US set the rules, enforced them, and provided public goods like security and free trade, the rest of the world would fall in line. This was the era of liberal hegemony, a world where American power was unchallenged, and American values were universal. But that world is gone. And the Essequibo crisis is just the latest example of why. The problem with liberal hegemony is that it assumes that other countries will accept US leadership indefinitely. It assumes that they'll play by the rules, even when those rules don't serve their interests. And it assumes that the US can afford to be the world's policeman forever. None of those assumptions hold up anymore. Russia and China have spent the last 2 decades building alternative institutions, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to challenge US dominance. They've created their own financial networks to bypass the dollar. They've developed military capabilities to deter US intervention. And they've cultivated alliances with countries that are tired of being told what to do by Washington. Venezuela is just one example. But it's a telling one. Because what Maduro is doing in Essequibo isn't just about oil. It's about demonstrating that the US can't enforce its will anymore. And if he succeeds, it won't be the last time we see this playbook. This is the real lesson of the Essequibo crisis. The US can no longer assume that its red lines will be respected, that its sanctions will be effective, or that its diplomatic pressure will be enough to bend smaller nations to its will. The uncomfortable truth is that we're watching the unraveling of a system that was never as stable as Washington believed. And the Essequibo crisis is just the latest thread being pulled. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of U.S. deterrence in Latin America, a region that Washington has long treated as its backyard. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine was the unspoken rule of the U.S. would tolerate no outside interference, and in return, it would call the shots. But that doctrine is now as dead as the Soviet Union, and the countries of Latin America know it. Take Brazil, for example. Under Lula, Brazil has made it clear that it will not automatically side with the U.S. on regional disputes. When Maduro announced his referendum on Essequibo, Lula didn't condemn it. Instead, he called for dialogue, positioning Brazil as a neutral mediator rather than a U.S. proxy. That might seem like a small thing, but in geopolitics, neutrality is a statement. It's a way of saying that the old rules no longer apply. Or look at Colombia. For years, Colombia was Washington's closest ally in South America, a bulwark against leftist movements and a key partner in the war on drugs. But under Gustavo Petro, Colombia has shifted course. It's restored relations with Venezuela, joined the BRICS, and even flirted with the idea of legalizing cocaine. None of this is accidental. It's a deliberate rejection of U.S. hegemony, and it's happening because Petro and many others in the region no longer believe that aligning with Washington is in their best interest. Here's the U.S. still has enormous influence in Latin America. It's the largest trading partner for most countries in the region, and its military presence is still significant. But influence is not the same as control. And the more the U.S. tries to reassert control through sanctions, through threats, through diplomatic pressure, the more it pushes countries like Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia into the arms of China and Russia. Let me explain why this matters. China isn't just a trading partner for Latin America, it's now the largest lender to the region, surpassing the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. Between 2005 and 2022, China extended over $137 billion in loans to Latin American countries, much of it for infrastructure projects that the U.S. and its allies have ignored. And Russia? It's not just selling arms to Venezuela. It's providing intelligence support, cyber capabilities, and even nuclear technology. In 2023, Russia and Bolivia signed a deal to build a nuclear research center in El Alto, just outside La Paz. That's not just a commercial agreement. It's a strategic foothold in the heart of South America. The military implications of this shift are even more alarming. For the first time since the Cold War, the U.S. is facing the prospect of a peer competitor operating in its own hemisphere. China's military base in Djibouti was just the beginning. In 2022, reports emerged that China was in talks with Cuba to establish a military presence on the island just 90 miles from Florida. The U.S. denied it, but the fact that such a possibility is even being discussed shows how much the ground has shifted. And Russia? It's already there. In 2019, Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela, a move that was as much about signaling as it was about capability. The message was if the U.S. can operate in Eastern Europe, Russia can operate in the Caribbean. Now, I'm not saying that China and Russia are about to invade Latin America. That's not how modern geopolitics works. What I am saying is that the U.S. is no longer the only game in town, and that has profound consequences for regional security. Take the drug trade, for example. For decades, the U.S. has treated drug trafficking as a law enforcement problem, using its military and intelligence assets to disrupt cartels in Colombia, Mexico, and Central America. But what happens when those cartels start working with Russian intelligence or Chinese money laundering networks? What happens when the U.S. no longer has the leverage to demand cooperation from governments that are increasingly aligned with its adversaries? The answer is that the U.S. will have to adapt or risk losing control of its own neighborhood. And that adaptation won't be easy. For one thing, the U.S. military is already stretched thin. Between Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, the Pentagon is struggling to maintain its global posture. Adding Latin America to that list would be a nightmare. For another, the U.S. no longer has the same economic leverage it once did. Sanctions worked when the U.S. dollar was the only game in town. But now, countries like Venezuela and Iran have learned to bypass the dollar through barter deals, cryptocurrencies, and alternative payment systems. The US can still impose costs, but it can't impose compliance. Here's the uncomfortable: the Essequibo crisis is a preview of what's to come. Not just in Latin America, but globally. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but power is relative. And as China, Russia, and other rising powers build their own networks of influence, the US will find itself in a world where its red lines are ignored, its sanctions are circumvented, and its alliances are no longer automatic. The question is, what does the US do about it? Does it double down on the old playbook, trying to reassert control through force and coercion? Or does it accept that the world has changed and adapt accordingly? So far, the signs aren't encouraging. The Biden administration's response to the Essequibo crisis has been a mix of bluster and indecision, threatening consequences but doing little to back them up. That's not leadership. That's weakness. And weakness, in geopolitics, is an invitation. If Maduro gets away with annexing Essequibo, it won't be the last time a country tests US resolve. If China and Russia see that the US can't protect its interests in its own hemisphere, they'll push harder elsewhere. The death of liberal hegemony isn't just a theoretical debate. It's a reality that's playing out in real time, and the consequences will shape the next century of global politics. The US can still shape that future. But it won't do so by pretending that the old rules still apply. It will do so by recognizing that the world has changed and by having the humility to change with it. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Essequibo crisis isn't just a foreign policy headache for Washington, it's a domestic political earthquake for Venezuela. And if we want to understand where this is all headed, we need to look beyond the maps and the oil reserves and focus on what's happening inside Caracas. Because Maduro's gamble in Essequibo isn't just about territory. It's about survival. Let me explain why this matters. Since 2018, when Maduro secured his second term in an election widely condemned as fraudulent, his regime has been in a slow-motion collapse. The economy has shrunk by more than 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has wiped out savings, and nearly 8 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the population, have fled the country. The opposition, once a formidable force, has been systematically dismantled. Leopoldo López, the most prominent opposition leader, is in exile. Enrique Capriles, another key figure, has been barred from running. And Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition's primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote, was disqualified from the 2024 presidential race by the Maduro-controlled Supreme Court. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just clinging to power. He's running out of options. The sanctions relief he secured in late 2023, when the US temporarily eased restrictions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for promises of free elections, was always a temporary lifeline. But the moment Machado's landslide primary victory made it clear that the opposition could actually win, Maduro's regime icked. The disqualifications, the crackdowns, the sudden escalation in Essequibo, these aren't coincidences. They're desperation plays. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election. Officially, Maduro is running for a third term. Unofficially, the election is already rigged. The opposition's most popular candidate is banned. The Electoral Council is stacked with regime loyalists. And the military, which has been the backbone of Chavismo since Hugo Chávez's rise in 1998, is being kept in line through a mix of patronage and repression. But here's the: even if Maduro wins in July, it won't be a victory. It'll be a holding action. The real question is what happens after the election. If the US reimposes sanctions, and it almost certainly will, given the lack of credible democratic reforms, Maduro will have to find new sources of revenue. That's where Essequibo comes in. The territory isn't just a nationalist rallying cry. It's a potential economic lifeline. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that Essequibo could hold up to 15 billion barrels of oil, more than Venezuela's current proven reserves. If Maduro can consolidate control, even symbolically, he can use that leverage to negotiate with China, Russia, and even Western energy commies desperate for new supply. But there's a catch. The Venezuelan military, which has historically been the arbiter of power in Caracas, is not a monolith. The high command is deeply corrupt, but the mid-level officers, many of whom have seen their families suffer under the economic collapse, are growing restless. There have already been whispers of discontent. In 2019, a group of officers led by Captain Javier Nieto Quintero attempted a coup. In 2020, another faction allegedly plotted to assassinate Maduro. And in 2023, the regime purged several generals suspected of disloyalty. Here's the scenario that keeps me up: Maduro wins the election, the US snaps back sanctions, and the economy collapses again. The military, already stretched thin, faces a choice: stick with Maduro and risk a popular uprising, or turn on him to save itself. If the generals decide to act, they won't do it out of love for democracy. They'll do it because they see Maduro as a liability. And if that happens, Venezuela could descend into a period of chaos that makes the last decade look stable by comparison. Now, let's talk about the opposition. Maria Corina Machado is a fascinating figure. She's not a traditional politician. She's a free market economist with deep ties to Washington and a reputation for uncompromising rhetoric. Her victory in the primary was a shock to the system, but her disqualification was predictable. The regime knows she's dangerous. The question is whether she can translate her popularity into real pressure on the streets. The opposition has tried mass protests before, most notably in 2017 and 2019, but the regime has always crushed them with brutal efficiency. This time, though, the stakes are higher. If Machado can mobilize enough people, she might force the military's hand. But here's the opposition is divided. Some factions, like the one led by former presidential candidate Enrique Capriles, have signaled a willingness to negotiate with the regime. Others, like Machado's movement, refuse to participate in what they see as a sham election. That division plays right into Maduro's hands. A fractured opposition is easier to control. So where does this leave us? In the short term, Maduro will likely win the election, consolidate power, and use the Essequibo crisis to rally nationalist support. But in the medium term, the regime is unsustainable. The economy is a basket case. The military is restless. And the opposition, despite its flaws, still has the potential to mobilize millions. The most likely outcome is a prolonged stalemate, neither collapse nor reform, but a slow, grinding decay. The real wild card is the US. What happens if the Biden administration, frustrated by Maduro's intransigence, decides to escalate? We've already seen hints of what that might look like. In April 2024, the US reimposed some sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector, a direct response to the regime's crackdown on the opposition. But if the US goes further, say, by targeting Venezuela's oil exports or freezing its foreign assets, it could push Maduro into a corner. And cornered regimes are dangerous. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela is a ticking time bomb. The Essequibo crisis is just the first tremor. The real earthquake is coming, and when it hits, it won't just be Venezuela that feels the shockwaves. It'll be the entire region. Colombia, already struggling with a migrant crisis, could see another wave of refugees. Brazil, which shares a porous border with Venezuela, would face new security challenges. And the US, which has spent the last decade trying to contain Venezuela's collapse, will be forced to confront a question it has avoided: for what happens when a failed state in your backyard starts exporting chaos? The answer, I suspect, is that we're about to find out. And it won't be pretty. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just another Latin American crisis, it's a test case for how the world's great powers will handle the next generation of failed states. Venezuela isn't Somalia or Afghanistan, it's a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves, a strategic position in the Caribbean, and a regime that has spent the last decade perfecting the art of playing Russia, China, Iran, and the US against each other. The question isn't whether Venezuela will collapse, but what kind of collapse it will be, and who gets to shape the aftermath. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. For the past 20 years, the US has treated Venezuela as a problem to be contained, not solved. The Obama administration's sanctions were half measures, designed to pressure Maduro without triggering a full-blown humanitarian disaster. Trump's maximum pressure campaign was more aggressive, but it was also scattershot, targeting individuals, freezing assets, and even floating the idea of a military coup, only to back off when the regime called his bluff. Biden, for all his talk of a new approach, has largely continued the same policy of incremental sanctions, occasional negotiations, and quiet diplomacy with regional allies like Colombia and Brazil. The problem? None of this has worked. Maduro is still in power, the economy is still in freefall, and the opposition is still divided. The U.S. is stuck in a cycle of reactive policymaking, where every escalation from Caracas is met with a new round of sanctions, which Maduro then uses to rally nationalist support. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. doesn't have a grand strategy for Venezuela because it doesn't know what it wants. Does it want regime change? If so, it's not willing to pay the price. Military intervention is off the table, and even covert support for the opposition has been inconsistent. Does it want to contain the crisis? Then it needs to accept that Maduro will remain in power, and that Venezuela will continue to be a hub for Russian arms sales, Chinese debt diplomacy, and Iranian proxy networks. Does it want to negotiate a transition? Then it needs to offer Maduro something he can't refuse: sanctions relief, amnesty, or a guaranteed exit strategy. But the U.S. can't even agree on which of these paths to take, let alone execute it effectively. Meanwhile, the other players in this game are playing for keeps. Russia has turned Venezuela into a forward operating base for its Wagner Group mercenaries and a testing ground for its hybrid warfare tactics. In 2020, Moscow sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force, and in 2023, it signed a $1.5 billion deal to modernize Venezuela's aging military. China, for its part, has turned Venezuela into a cautionary tale for its Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing has lent Caracas over $60 billion since 2007, most of which has been squandered or stolen, but it keeps the loans flowing because it needs Maduro's oil and his loyalty in international forums like the UN. Iran has used Venezuela as a backdoor for its sanctions evasion schemes, sending oil tankers to Caracas in exchange for gold and access to Latin American markets. Even Turkey, under Erdogan, has gotten in on the act, helping Venezuela launder its gold through Istanbul's financial system. What's striking about all of this is how little the U.S. has done to counter it. The Biden administration has focused on rebuilding alliances in Europe and Asia, but it's treated Latin America as an afterthought. The last time a U.S. president visited the region was in 2018, when Trump attended the G20 summit in Argentina. Biden hasn't even bothered to appoint a permanent ambassador to the Organization of American States. The message this sends is the U.S. cares more about Ukraine and Taiwan than it does about its own hemisphere. And that's a mistake, because Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine for a much larger problem: the erosion of U.S. influence in its own backyard. Now, let's talk about the alternatives. The first is the status muddling through, imposing sanctions when Maduro overreaches, offering concessions when he plays nice, and hoping that anything changes. This is the path of least resistance, but it's also the path of least results. Maduro has survived this long because he's mastered the art of brinkmanship. He knows that the U.S. won't invade, that the opposition is too divided to pose a real threat, and that Russia and China will keep propping him up as long as it serves their interests. The status quo is a slow-motion disaster, but it's a disaster that the U.S. can ignore for now. The second alternative is escalation. The U.S. could double down on sanctions, targeting not just Maduro's inner circle but the entire Venezuelan economy. It could freeze the regime's foreign assets, cut off its access to the global financial system, and work with allies to intercept its oil shipments. It could also ramp up support for the opposition, providing funding, training, and even weapons to anti-Maduro factions. The risk here is that Maduro would retaliate by expelling U.S. diplomats, seizing American assets, or even attacking U.S. interests in the region. He could also escalate the Essequibo crisis, provoking a military confrontation with Guyana that draws in Brazil and the U.S. The last thing the Biden administration wants is another foreign policy crisis in an election year, but if Maduro feels cornered, he might not give them a choice. The third alternative is negotiation. The U.S. could offer Maduro a sanctions relief, a path to legitimacy, and even a role in a transitional government in exchange for free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and an end to the repression. This is the path that the Biden administration has been hinting at, but it's a long shot. Maduro has no incentive to negotiate unless he's convinced that the alternative is worse than the status quo. And right now, he's not. The opposition is weak, the military is loyal, and his foreign backers are still willing to prop him up. The only way negotiations work is if the US is willing to make a credible threat of force, but that's a line no US president has been willing to cross since the Monroe Doctrine. The fourth alternative is the most acceptance. The US could recognize that Maduro isn't going anywhere, that the opposition is too divided to pose a real threat, and that the best it can do is contain the fallout. This would mean reopening diplomatic channels, easing sanctions, and working with regional allies to manage the humanitarian crisis. It would also mean accepting that Venezuela will remain a Russian and Chinese client state, a haven for organized crime, and a source of instability for years to come. This is the path of realism, but it's also the path of surrender. And in Washington, surrender is not an option. So where does that leave us? With a mess, frankly. Venezuela is a problem with no good solutions, only bad ones and worse ones. The US is caught between its ideals and its interests, between its desire to promote democracy and its need to prevent chaos. The region is watching, waiting to see whether Washington will step up or step back. And Maduro? He's playing the long game, betting that he can outlast his enemies, both at home and abroad. Here's what I think will happen. In the short term, Maduro will win the July election, either by rigging it outright or by ensuring that the opposition is too divided to challenge him. He'll use the victory to consolidate power, purge the military of potential rivals, and double down on his nationalist rhetoric. The US will respond with more sanctions, but they won't be enough to topple the regime. Russia and China will continue to prop him up, seeing Venezuela as a useful foil to US influence in the hemisphere. The opposition will fracture further, with some factions opting for negotiation and others for resistance. And the Venezuelan people? They'll keep fleeing, keep suffering, and keep waiting for a miracle that never comes. In the medium term, the crisis will deepen. The economy will continue to collapse, the military will grow more restless, and the regime will become more repressive. The Essequibo dispute will flare up again, possibly leading to a low-level conflict with Guyana. The US will be forced to take a harder line, either by escalating sanctions or by increasing its military presence in the region. And the other Latin American countries, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, will be left to pick up the pieces, dealing with the refugees, the crime, and the instability that Venezuela exports. In the long term, Venezuela will either collapse or transition, but not in the way that the US or the opposition hopes. If the regime collapses, it won't be because of a democratic uprising or a US-backed coup. It will be because the military turns on Maduro, or because the economy implodes so completely that even the regime's cronies can't keep it afloat. And if there's a transition, it won't be to democracy. It will be to a new form of authoritarianism, one that's more pragmatic, more corrupt, and more willing to cut deals with the US and its allies. Either way, the Venezuelan people will lose. This is the tragedy of Venezuela. It's a country with immense potential: oil, gas, minerals, a skilled workforce, a strategic location, but it's been ruined by decades of mismanagement, corruption, and ideological extremism. The US has tried to fix it, but its efforts have been half-hearted, inconsistent, and often counterproductive. The region has tried to help, but it's too divided, too weak, and too distracted by its own problems. And the Venezuelan people? They've been abandoned by their leaders, their neighbors, and the world. So what's the lesson here? That failed states don't stay contained. That the US can't ignore its own hemisphere without paying a price. That the old rules of geopolitics, spheres of influence, balance of power, deterrence still matter, even in an age of globalization and digital warfare. Venezuela is a warning, not just for Latin America, but for the world. The question is whether anyone is listening.